Welcome. Thanks very much to NZGBC and ICA for organising and for inviting me. I've been asked to speak about the lessons from Australia. I'll start with a disclaimer that this isn't a prescription for New Zealand, Big Brother across the ditch telling you how it should be. This is more a kind of showcase of ideas that have worked for us. I do think the New Zealand experience will be different. When we started our journey in 1998, a few things were different. The attitudes to sustainability, both on an individual level and on a corporate level, were quite different. You now have the Paris Agreement coming into effect. In New Zealand, your energy grid is made up of quite different sources. It's a much less carbon-intensive grid, so your motivations for energy efficiency will be different. You have a different structure of government. You don't have the layer of state government, so that's going to be different as well. It's more a kind of showcase of ideas. Here's what worked for us. Hopefully you'll be able to adapt some of the ideas and for your context. So look, I guess the best place to start with is why we created NABERS. We created it to deal with the problem of existing buildings. A lot of new buildings were being built to higher standards of sustainability, but back then, 1998, 80% of the building stock was over a decade old, and we could see that they would be with us for many decades to come. They were built often before sustainability was really a criteria for people, and that's where the bulk of emissions was going to come for us. We thought about 10% of Australia's emissions were coming from Australia's commercial buildings. So we created a benchmark to make performance highly visible. All of the stuff that goes on in the basement and plant rooms make it highly visible, allow building owners to have a tool that they can compare their performance with the market and compete for environmental credentials. Making it highly visible is what attracted me. So unlike a lot of yourselves, I'm not a building services engineer. I'm not from the property sector either, and I'm not even from government really. I'm a psychologist by trade. I started out as a clinical psychologist, and I got concerned with the environmental issues, so I tried to see how I could adapt my skills for the sustainability sector. I did a research project into all the different behavioural interventions that you can do to influence behaviour. So I looked at kind of education, feedback, rewards, goal setting, that kind of thing. And they're all quite dismally poor at affecting change, except for one, which is comparative feedback, so feedback that compares people with other people. And so the natural conclusion is then if you want to encourage sustainable behaviour, you need to make behaviour highly visible, and that's kind of what NABERS does, so that's what attracted me to the program. So that's a little bit about why. I should also mention, look, 1998, we took a sample of buildings, and using a multiple regression analysis, we created a 5-star scale, where 1 was poor, 2.5 was average, and 5 stars was market leading. The first few years running the program, a lot of it was trying to convince progressive property owners to rate their buildings. A lot of the issues that we had were, when we did get a handful commissioned, was that the rules were not very clear, so assessors were interpreting them in different ways. We were getting quite different results. So those initial years, it was about getting the rules in a consistent format and training the assessors well. By 2003, we were getting quite consistent ratings, and that's why it's quite a rule-based system now. And in 2003, that's when we got our first major kind of shot in the arm from policy. So that's when the New South Wales government said that all government-owned and leased buildings must have and disclose a NABERS rating. So that took it from the realm of kind of corporate social responsibility to something with a direct financial incentive. If you want a government tenant now, you have to have and disclose a NABERS rating. And people want, aside from the fact that in New South Wales we're the biggest single tenant in the state, governments also tend to sign long leases and reliably pay their rent. So they're quite attractive tenants in that respect. So that was the first thing that happened, and you can see from this chart here, the first kind of spike in the blue line, we went from doing, I think, less than 50 ratings a year to doing about 300 ratings a year. So the next big thing that happened was that the Australian federal government they kind of added to that procurement policy. They said in order to get an Australian federal government tenant, you now not even only have to have and disclose a NABERS rating, but you also have to have a 4.5 star NABERS rating. So that created an economic incentive for having a high rating. Same year, 2006, the Property Council of Australia put in their quality matrix that if you want to be considered an A grade or a premium building, you had to have a 4.5 star NABERS rating. So another kind of financial or prestige incentive to getting high performing buildings. You'll notice there that another kind of data point which will no doubt intrigue you. We'll come back to that one. So in 2008, first in 2006 something else happened which is worth mentioning. We expanded the suite of rating tools from energy for offices. We added water, indoor environment quality and waste management tools. We also created energy and water tools for hotels and shopping centres. And in 2013, a little bit later on, we've now just created an energy tool for data centres. Data centres is a kind of really rapidly growing user of energy in the built environment sector. So 2008, another incentive scheme was put in place. This is the Energy Savings Scheme. So it's a white certificate scheme. To explain white certificate schemes briefly, the government put in place, it said to the energy retailers, you're going to have energy efficiency targets. And to prove those targets, you're going to need to hand over a certain amount of certificates every year to the government. And the energy retailers can buy those certificates from accredited certificate providers out in the market who can do accredited projects, and they can then sell those certificates to the retailer, or they can trade them on the open market. So NABERS was considered one way of generating those certificates because it's done by independent assessors and it's a government accredited scheme. So you can take your 2-star NABERS rating certificate one year and your 5-star certificate a few years later, and you can generate certificates from that which is redeemable for cash. So you can see here the blue line is the amount of dollars generated, the green line is the amount of, we call them ESCIs, energy saving certificates. There's a noticeable difference between 2012-13 and 2013-14. You can see the number of ESCIs rose quite rapidly, but the amount of cash dropped. That's because the spot price for ESCIs on the market dropped. Market's doing what they do. The spot price has now risen again. So it's the Energy Savings Scheme. To give you an indication of what this means for building owners, Investor use this one quite regularly. They say that using the Energy Savings Scheme, it pays for about 15% of building upgrades. So another incentive scheme that came in 2008 was the Green Building Fund. The government provided funds for building owners to upgrade their buildings so long as they could prove it with a NABERS rating afterwards. 2009, there was a couple of research pieces done. One Drew was talking about earlier, the low energy high-rise study, which looked at all of the different interventions and how cost effective they were, how much of an impact that they had. The second one was the start of the Australian Green Property Index, which people talk about quite a lot. That looked at the correlation between NABERS ratings and investment returns, things like lease expiry, green premiums on rent, vacancy rates, that kind of thing. And it found that buildings with high energy ratings have consistently better investment returns, which is kind of empirical evidence that all of these policies that we're putting in place to create economic incentives for high-performing buildings are actually working. So coming back to that blue spike, this is the one that everyone's interested in. This was mandatory disclosure. So this happened in 2010 under the BEAD Act. The Australian federal government said that anyone selling or leasing space over 2,000 square metres must have a valid NABERS energy rating. The penalties are quite strict. If you don't have one, you advertise one, it's $170,000 the first day and $17,000 a day thereafter until you either take the building off the market or get a NABERS rating. So they're quite strict. The impact, the reception that I had from industry was very good for regulation. I think it's important to understand the reason why I had a good reception from industry, and that's because most of the major portfolios were already on board. The premium property portfolios had got on board back in 2004 when the first procurement policies were in place. So they'd been disclosing, they'd been upgrading their buildings. For them, mandatory disclosure meant that the rest of the market had to turn over their cards, and they had a positive point of difference in the market. So that's why it was kind of well received by market, because it was in sequence with a bunch of other policies. I'll go through some statistics for you. It brought into contact with us a new cohort of buildings we hadn't really dealt with before. They, on the whole, were smaller buildings and more energy intensive buildings, but they did reduce their energy consumption quite rapidly. You can see here that the newcomers over the 4 years to 2014 had reduced their energy to the point that they were as efficient as the veterans when they started in 2010. Just an example of what mandatory disclosure did. So Satish was mentioning before this idea of understanding what energy kilowatt hours per metre square means. A star rating scale really helps people to understand. So previously we had people rating that had a portfolio of buildings, so they might have some level of comparison. They might know what's a reasonable amount to be paying for energy. But under mandatory disclosure, it brought in a whole bunch of building owners that maybe owned just one building. So they paid their energy bill, they didn't know whether it was high or low. Suddenly they're made to get a NABERS rating, they get a 0-star rating, they go, hold on, they get an energy audit and they find that they've got a chiller and a boiler that are kind of constantly on and fighting each other. So it can really help kind of identifying those kind of opportunities. The next thing that happened for us in 2011, we expanded the star rating scale. So as I said before, it started out as a 5-star rating scale, and back in 1998 there were no 5-star buildings. No one knew how to build a 5-star building. It was set as a stretch target. But in 2010, a few building owners were hitting 5 stars and they wanted something else to aim for. So we expanded the scale to 6 stars as halfway between 5 stars and a hypothetical 7-star zero emissions building. So a 6-star building has 50% less than a 5-star building. So you can see, here's the rating results with that in mind. Here's the rating results in 2007. You see 8% are getting 4.5 or 5-star. When mandatory disclosure came in, that's jumped up to 19%. And the results from this year's annual report, we're now getting more than half the buildings performing at 4.5 stars or above. And we're getting a few buildings starting to hit 6-star, which is a really, from a building services point of view, it's a really phenomenal achievement. And here's an extension to that slide that Drew was showing earlier with slightly more updated figures. This is the average improvement in building performance over time as buildings are re-rated. I think it's important to kind of note, this is not cherry-picked top performers. This is the average across the whole data set. So if you've been rating 10 times, on average you're going to have reduced your energy consumption 35% and your carbon emissions 42%. So I think very much in terms of hitting New Zealand's targets for carbon emissions reductions, this is a big sector. Effectively getting on board with NABERS can really help you guys do that. So this one might be of interest to property owners out there. This shows you the improvement by major portfolios over time. And look, you do get stories in the news about how well the Australian property sector is doing. I guess the important thing this slide shows is that it has been a journey over time, and some portfolios started with quite average ratings, but also the leadership shown by industry. So the orange line is Investor. They were the first portfolio to rate in 2004, to rate and disclose their whole portfolio. And that took a level of leadership by industry, and it's important the government shows leadership, but it's also important that industry shows leadership. You may be wondering, so most of the policies and initiatives I've talked about have been Energy for Offices tool, how well the other tools are doing, particularly if they haven't been supported, and can a tool succeed if it's not supported by policy and initiatives. So I'd like to give you a couple of examples. The first one is the shopping centres tool. That's doing fairly well. We're getting quite a few ratings. It's not really supported by policy. The reason for that, I think, is partly because a lot of the shopping centre owners are also own office buildings, so they have NABERS in their corporate policies. And the other reason is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, which is basically international investors use this benchmark to determine where they're going to invest their funds. And it drives a lot of international investment into Australia. So people can use their NABERS ratings to gain points in that. So that's the kind of driver behind that. Hotels has done less well. We had a spike in ratings when we had the Green Building Fund, and they've kind of dipped again now. We are in talks with the New South Wales government about putting NABERS targets in the government accommodation criteria, and so hopefully that will spark a few ratings. But I think it is important to show that it really does need some level of support from policy. Other schemes I may not have time to talk about. One I'd like to mention is the No More Average Buildings campaign, which we launched this financial year. So looking at the data set, we now have only 100 or so buildings left in New South Wales that are performing at 3 stars or below. So this is targeted funding from the government to get those buildings performing above 3 stars. So there's money for energy audits and matched funding for retrofits and that kind of thing. As Drew mentioned, we've now hit 15,000 ratings. That's our program manager Carlos with John Vesper from Goodman. They had the 15,000th rating for one of their Sydney buildings. I hear Goodman had quite a big portfolio over here as well, so that's good. Lastly, I said this wasn't going to be a prescription for NABERSNZ, but if there is a take-home lesson, it is that the property sector has done really well from NABERS. They've learnt that by getting on board with a government-accredited independent rating system, they can get a lot of incentives from government. And of the property owners that have done well, the early adopters have done the most well. They're the ones that got the government tenants. They're the ones that do better in the GRES ranking and attracts more international investment. They're the ones that typically use schemes like the Energy Savings Scheme and got money from the Green Building Fund. So the lesson would be an early adopter, I would say. The energy efficiency industry has obviously done very well as well, selling a lot of services. There's now 600 NABERS assessors active. Of those, there's about 150 that are really active. And there are some businesses now that just do NABERS ratings. That's their kind of core business. They employ 3 or 4 people. So it's been very good for the energy efficiency industry. For advocates for the program, the advice would be work with all different layers of government. Certainly something that has worked for us has been the ability to, when we had maybe a conservative government at a federal level, but more progressive government at a state level, to work with the state governments. And I think that could work well over here as well. If you're not getting traction in one layer of government, work with the local councils. You may get a local council that would set a procurement policy. And it's always easier to get other states or governments to adopt things once you have a precedent. And that's kind of what excites me about NABERSNZ, is that we now have a federation of building programs. So we can kind of point in your direction when you guys come up with innovative policies that we don't have. We can say, oh, these guys are doing that, that's working well, we should do that as well. So on that note, I'd like to thank ICA and NZGBC again for inviting me, because it's opportunities like this where we can share the learnings. So yeah, thanks.